that idea of not seeing what is happening in the relationship happens, not because you are in denial, not because you are dumb, not because you're a codependent, but because there is a cost to seeing the bad things happening in the relationship. Something I hear all the time from people is, I know I need to leave this relationship, but the good stuff makes it hard to leave. Or, now that this relationship is over, it's so hard. I miss the good stuff. When I hear that, I'm curious about what this good stuff was. And the stuff that is shared about the so-called good stuff that a person misses, or that would make it hard to leave a toxic relationship, it's often stuff that actually isn't all that good. Or it's actually sort of an intoxicating dynamic that isn't so good. But folks said the good was a sort of waiting and wondering and a sense that maybe this time it could be different, right? Lots of people get stuck in narcissistic relationships, or actually even originally get into them because of the so-called good things that are on display. These good things may be stuff or actions or whatever words that convinced you into the relationship, even in the early days when you might have had that spidey sense that something wasn't quite right. The good things, whatever those were to you, may have blurred your vision or even kept you stuck long after the relationship became quite toxic. Your good thing is not someone else's good thing. Sure, there are some universals, but even those, for example, even attractiveness isn't always universal. For example, some folks would say, and I've heard people say, it feels uncomfortable to be in a relationship with someone who's judged to be too attractive because it sort of brings up insecurities and things, right? You may love dogs and someone else doesn't like them at all. So a partner with lots of dogs might be very attractive to one person, not at all attractive to someone else. But that stuff is all superficial stuff. As we dig deeper, it may be stuff like that's the good stuff, is like being really organized or being really responsible or being really disciplined or being really outgoing or being serious or sharing emotions readily. It could be things that wouldn't register to other people as good. Again, we're all different, so the things that are good might feel different. And then there is the stuff that gets you stuck, that nobody would likely think is good. For example, someone who always feels just a bit slippery or just out of reach, and the good thing is the game of it all and having to win them over. I mean, that's exhausting. But for people who have it, it's often an old wound, and a wound that can keep you on the hook. The breakup, makeup cycle, it can feel very ancient. And you may have even had the experience of relationships where your relationship almost felt easy. The other person didn't feel slippery at all. They were open, they were available, they were responsive. And some people sometimes judge relationships like that as uninteresting or not intimate or romantic. So these things, whatever these things are that are good, that keep a person stuck in a narcissistic relationship, have backstories. Now, some of the backstories are not that interesting and may merely be a byproduct of what society tells us we are supposed to want or value, stuff like money, appearance, credentials. But others, these are personal to you. In fact, some people wouldn't find them good at all or even downright ick. But the narcissistic relationship's good in your book comes from something far deeper. And these good things matter because they may have been what made the relationship hard to leave or provided the substantiation for the justifications. For example, a person in a relationship who is very financially careful, saves their money, lives according to a strict budget, that may not be a good thing necessarily to everyone, but the backstory on that may be that you grew up with selfish, immature, financially irresponsible parents. That this new person in your life, their sort of save their pennies way of being, even if it results in them being sort of miserly and not particularly generous, may still strangely feel good and may get turned into a narrative that feels safe. Another example could be that someone grew up with a very weak father, and the father was railroaded by your narcissistic mother or by their narcissistic boss, and then you meet a man who had qualities such as decisiveness, maybe even physical strength. That might be something you experience as good stuff. And unless you pay attention, you may feel stuck in what you're thinking is this good thing, which stops being good after a while if the person has narcissistic patterns, but the narrative is already written about it. Sometimes the good is merely that they are the opposite of your former toxic partner. So the original partner you had, the original narcissistic partner, may have come home late all the time and been shady and dodgy and betrayal-y. The new partner may be self-righteous and controlling and cold, but they don't cheat. And those good things that feel hard to leave or felt like a lot to lose, it's easy when you're navigating the very confusing aftermath of a narcissistic relationship to get lost in the stuff you lost, instead of focusing on why these things even felt like good things you lost. The origin story of the stuff that felt compelling, the stuff you miss, the stuff you still think about it. Dig deeper. Why was it good? Why was it good? Now listen, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Maybe you just missed the good sex or their blue eyes. But you also may miss the sense of family you created, holiday traditions, a home. And even though they treated you badly within those structures, they may have been an overriding of what you didn't get in childhood, for example. You may miss the feeling and the tension reduction that would come from the breakup-makeup cycles. It may have reproduced that sense of being able to win over that unavailable parent. You may miss the times your narcissistic partner would come back after an infidelity and that dynamic of being chosen and hoovered. It's a powerful one if that didn't happen for you in childhood. And that could be the good thing, but those aren't good things. They're just powerful counterweights. And frankly, the more that these good things tie into these deeper origin stories, the more they can make you feel stuck and missing your narcissistic relationship and not being able to mentally let it go, and even not always even able to articulate what's the good stuff you miss. But a big step to mentally letting it go is figuring out what made the good feel good. And was it good, or was it evocative? Was it familiar, or was it a triumph? Was the little kid in you getting the win where you didn't as a child? Was it the false sense of safety you got in the narcissistic relationship because it was so different than your origin story? Dig into that. And as you do, you may feel some of that rumination lift, and you may get not only a hell of a lot more clarity, but you may not feel as sort of stuck in the post-relationship landscape. Folks, we always make it about abandonment in these relationships and that we're afraid the relationships end because we're afraid of abandonment, but it's also losing this sense of this moment that we thought we could actually be ourselves in a relationship. So you all know on this channel that I get very frustrated at content that focuses on the idea that some people are just narcissist magnets and attract them, or all the codependency nonsense. I just don't agree with it when it comes to narcissistic relationships. One could easily argue, and I would, that we are all to some degree vulnerable to narcissistic relationships, and that there may be certain vulnerability factors in us that may make us more likely to get stuck. But I have yet to meet the person who is fully immune to charm, charisma, confidence, and attractiveness. Narcissistic folks are very beautiful in the beginning when we first meet them, and nobody says no to someone who's beautiful. Then, as it always does in a narcissistic relationship, these relationships transition into devalue and discard and fall apart. They always do. There is no version of the narcissistic relationship where this doesn't happen unless you just have the capacity to break up with them during the love bomb stage. And that's pretty rare for someone to do that. And as the relationship unfolds, you're confused. And most of us at this point don't run away from the narcissistic relationship, even once they start devaluing and discarding us. But instead, We are more likely to wonder what we are doing wrong because after all, just a month ago, the relationship was everything we ever wanted, right? We thought we were falling deeply in love, that this was our person. It was as though they could read our mind. I'll say more about that in this video. We believed this was real. And real can't go so wrong so fast, right? So to maintain some sense of control, which is very common, that we're going to blame ourselves. Now, one of the quick armchair takes on this is that, oh, well, people don't want to leave the narcissistic relationship because of abandonment issues, right? Many people who are going through the devalue or discard phase will wonder, well, maybe I'm not leaving because I have abandonment issues. And if I leave, I don't want them to find someone else. And then they'll do a deep analysis and a deep dive of their childhood and past relationships and pin it all to abandonment. And I have no doubt that there is some truth to the abandonment hypothesis for more than a few people. But it's not all. Every person in a narcissistic relationship is not a person with abandonment issues, not by a long shot. I want you to sit a moment, though, and take a minute and think about what is the one thing we most want in a relationship? Because there's a right answer to this question. What is the one thing we want, crave, have wanted since we were born? And if you were lucky, you got it as an infant and in childhood. And if you don't get this thing, then you crave it like hell as you go through childhood into adolescence and adulthood. It's a deeply human thing to want, even need, and it can get us into a lot of trouble in narcissistic relationships. What is it? You can even pause the video here. You can drop your answer in the comments. It's pretty simple. And the answer is to be seen. That's it. That's the core of love. It's not gifts or epic sex or a fairy tale romance or gorgeous face or money or a gorgeous body or even charm or charisma. It's not compassion. It's to be seen, to be really seen, maybe to be experienced. In that way, all of us needed and wanted as small children to be seen. And then as we get into adulthood, to extend that to someone who gets us and sees our strength and loves us through our weaknesses, who loves our quirks, notices our gifts, who can see we're having a bad day and gives us a shoulder rub or a gentle smile, and on a good day is happy for us. That's what we want. And when we find it, it feels magical. And it can be the beginning of a love story. We want this in our friends. We want this in people we work with. Listen, we'd even take it from a stranger, to be seen. Think of your truly good relationships in your life. Even if you just have one relationship in your life you consider good. Why is it good? Because you feel seen by them, and odds are that you see them too, and it feels so real. We are social creatures. We even have neuronal systems in our brain that need this seenness, and we give that seenness back. Here's the problem. In the first 6 weeks of a relationship, narcissistic people are world-class ICUers. They are almost magical at it. They tell you that your so-called weaknesses that you've confessed to them don't matter, that they love you more because of them. They tell you about your strengths, your beauty, all the things they like about you, adore about you, and love in you. And you do the same for them. You are being sculpted into perfect supply. But that is happening at the same time that you are finally feeling seen, seen, seen. You may look back at past relationships where your quirks and preferences and things that make you may have been devalued or minimized. And then this new partner comes along and tells you they love your cats and that they love you even though you come from a wacky, crazy family, and that you have curves in all the right places, and they love your creative side. All the things you have always wanted to be seen, they see, and they don't criticize, and it feels like the ultimate correction of all the bad things that have happened in the past. And not only are you seen, you may feel, after even a few weeks of this, or certainly a month or two of this, you may feel like you can open up and be your true self. Finally be vulnerable after years or even decades of being a clenched soul. Because to feel we can show up as our authentic selves with someone is one of the most beautiful, divine, and transcendent feelings in the world. The narcissistic person's capacity for charm, charisma, and CIA-level interrogation in a way that you don't even know you're being interrogated to get classified information out of you can bring down our walls pretty quickly. Because they're showing up with that thing we all want, to be seen, that normal and human thing to want, because once they have you there, I hate to say it, but it's like a boxer getting an opponent on the ropes. They have you, and they know it. The reason love bombing works and can show up in so many different ways is because being seen means different things to all of us. For example, I'll put myself out there. For with a person like me, if a person showed up with luxe gifts and a fancy car, not only would that not win me over, it would turn me off. That doesn't feel like being seen to someone like me. But to another person, it may feel very much like being seen. To another person, someone wanting to be with them all the time would feel like being seen. To another person, it might feel like too much. For me, being seen as someone emptying the dishwasher and taking out the trash cans. We all got a thing. The narcissistic love bomber calibrates to what the person wants and ultimately finds their best match in someone who wants the things that they are offering. They search for the vulnerabilities, which they may do this by saying things like, I want this to be a deep and honest relationship. Really tell me about you. And then that interrogation begins. But you think it's just profound intimacy. But rather, it's a process of learning your buttons. Buttons that will be pushed and used to manipulate you once the devalue phase begins. So the reason so many people get stuck in these relationships isn't necessarily fear of abandonment or so-called abandonment issues, but rather it's about letting go of the experience of being what felt like, at least for a moment, of being really seen. Hundreds of survivors have said to me that this is what they're struggling with in the wake of a narcissistic relationship ending. Letting go of what felt so connected, so unique, so being seen. It's not about abandonment, as much as it is the loss of that acutely important and human need and want to be seen. The need we have had since the day we were born. In fact, we may not even actually miss the narcissistic person as much as we miss what for a moment in time felt like a perfect mirror. I'm going to briefly share two stories here to sort of bring this to life. One was a person who had had back-to-back unhealthy relationships with men that were riddled with infidelity, and she had kind of given up. And then was introduced to someone who a group of her friends believed would be a good match. He was physically her type, handsome guy, and it seemed that in a very brief period of time, he sort of got her. The classical, their first date went until sunrise. It was almost as though he was purpose-built for her and she for him. He knew exactly what to say to her to allay her fears. He cared about the same things as her. He didn't mock some of her quirky things that everyone, including her friends, would sometimes poke at. On his side, in her, he found someone. She herself was quite financially successful. She was connected to lots of powerful people. So he got lots of supply. And he himself was going through a relatively rough patch financially. So he was kind of drawn to, the splendor of her world. The devalue in their relationship started about after 6 months. And those things he would compliment her on and those vulnerabilities she shared because she felt seen and she felt safe were now constantly being derided. And that included her friends, her family, her home, the way she spent money, the stuff in her refrigerator. But she had told herself the story that he ticked all the boxes and that people didn't see what he was like when nobody was around. Needless to say, it didn't end well after many, many years. Cheating, hoovering, the whole thing. The woman in this relationship was not a person with abandonment issues, but rather, for her, the seeming miracle of finding someone that she believed for a moment really saw her meant that 5 months of that became 5 very difficult years. I've been here too. Being seen is a big psychological issue for me, I'll own it. And so I was vulnerable to getting stuck repeatedly. It took me becoming much older to work that shit through. But it meant that when someone seemed to get me and be okay with what I thought were weaknesses in me that nobody would put up with, oh, how I wish for a do-over. I put up with terrible abuse as part of that narcissistic transaction. And all of this highlights why, for example, a person who, for example, was invalidated and never seen as a child, which is a lot of people, or someone who's very isolated, could be very vulnerable to that dynamic of being seen. If this is something that has not happened to someone before, a skilled narcissistic person with that capacity to engage in the short-term seeing during the love bombing phase will not only be able to control a person in a situation like this more quickly, but it will be more difficult for a person with this kind of history to extricate. When someone shows up with that thing we have never had, but are wired to need and want, it is a profound power. And all of that interest the narcissistic person shows and the questions they ask and seemingly listen to our answers without judgment in the beginning can feel initially liberating. But sadly, over time, the narcissistic person may simply be learning about your vulnerabilities so that they can be more easily weaponized down the road. Wanting to be seen and wanting to be vulnerable is healthy and good. But unfortunately, narcissistic folks are really good at mimicry and at playing at that, turning us into perfect supply and leaving us grasping and fighting for that experience, that short-lived experience of being seen in the relationship to continue. It ain't an abandonment issue. But as with all things in narcissistic relationships, the good stuff never lasts. As I've said repeatedly, the challenge raised by narcissistic relationships, it's not the issue of us getting into them. It's the issue of us getting stuck in them. The getting out is what is hard, especially after stuff like trauma bonding kicks in, as well as the enabling by people who keep telling you stuff like, give it a chance, or I'm sure they don't mean it when they say that or do that, and then the confusion of all of it, and especially if this is a repeat of what things were like, for example, in a narcissistic family system, it's hard. And if it feels unsafe to leave, then it's even more difficult. But this cycle starts even earlier. So let's break this down a little bit. It starts first with the idea that I am bad for seeing this new person as bad. In essence, you are judging yourself for seeing red flags. That's often where this process starts. People will feel like, oh, maybe I'm judgmental. Maybe I'm the overly critical one. Maybe I'm the problem. When you may spot behavior, especially early on, that is gaslighting or toxic or manipulative. Remember, this uncomfortable, unhealthy behavior is inevitably embedded within this larger context of these good things or charming things or attractive things that they're doing. They may do something that feels considerate. You may have fun with them. This person may make you laugh. There may be days that they do nice things for you. And remember, in the early days of a relationship, it's not as though you have a history with them. So then, when they do a bad thing, it's still embedded in this larger context of doing some nice things. And especially if you grew up with this kind of backing and forthing between some good things and a lot of bad things, and frankly, even if you didn't, You do believe when you notice those bad things that I'm being too demanding. Maybe my standards are too high. Maybe I'm asking too much. No wonder I'm single. I ask for too much. Or that you're a bad person for seeing their behavior as manipulative or gaslighting or as invalidation or betrayal. And you may also have other people say to you, oh, come on now. Nobody's perfect. But this isn't about perfect. If you're in a relationship with someone who, for example, who acts like a victim every time things don't go their way, this is about that. Or it's about someone who may tell you lies when it works for them. Or it may be that you're in a relationship with a person who's dismissive of what matters to you. But hey, they bought you dinner and paid for all of your friends to go away for a birthday weekend. So that erases the slate, right? And that you're a bad person for seeing them as bad because they did that nice thing. And this is a tiny but important shift that ends up happening in the relationship, because now that part of you, bad you, now that bad you's in the house. And you may consider bad you to be demanding you, unrealistic expectation having you, needy you. And so you may then make more allowances for their bad behavior and over appreciate the good stuff they do. But one day you can't not see these patterns. The relationship becomes increasingly uncomfortable. The emotional abuse keeps mounting up. You find yourself more and more hypervigilant, walking on eggshells. You feel like you can't be yourself. You start staying quiet because you don't want to make them mad. But hey, you're the one who's bad too, right? You're the one who has unrealistic standards. You're the one with unrealistic expectations. And maybe that's why the relationship is so bad, right? It's all your fault. So that same way you thought you were a problem in the beginning of the relationship for noticing some of those red flags, for thinking that meant you had unrealistic standards, now you think you're just a bad person and a problem, full stop. And that it's your identity. And the narcissistic person is saying it more in the relationship, saying things to you like, you aren't affectionate enough, you aren't nice enough, you ask for too much, you're greedy, you're selfish, you aren't you're just not enough. You're a problem. Well, now, even if you do start to see these behaviors in the relationship as bad, well, that belief system has seeped into you, and now you view yourself as bad too, as you're a problem too. So you may not feel like you have grounds to push back or leave, because maybe you stay even because you feel like, oh, I don't have a strong argument to leave this. I suck. They suck. This all sucks. And then you feel stuck. And you may not see it. And that's the real problem. Betrayal blindness is real. That idea of not seeing what is happening in the relationship happens not because you are in denial, not because you are dumb, not because you're a codependent, but because there is a cost to seeing the bad things happening in the relationship. At first, you may not really understand what is happening, sure, but the real issue becomes that there is a cost to seeing it. You may feel that you can't stay in it, or that if you see the bad things happening, that means ending it to you. And then you may forestall something that matters to you, like getting married or having children, or maybe you already have children or live together, or you have your own wounds and fears about being abandoned or being alone. There is a sort of protective process around not fully encoding the small and big betrayals. And it sort of does have a big payoff. It means you can stay. If you don't see it, you can stay. And if you stay, then you don't have to endure the anxiety, the fear, the disruption to life and to the trauma bond that can fill us with panic. Now, it's not like that bad stuff that you were betrayal blind to doesn't enter your psyche. It does. And all that betrayal sort of piles up in a big dysfunctional pile of ick in your brain. And you start feeling things like anxious and physically ill, disconnected, numb, dysregulated. You don't feel like yourself. So the not seeing is not intentional, it's protective. And you stay because those reasons, those betrayals, the reasons to leave, kind of get sort of cordoned off in your brain. You don't sort of see them. So you don't do anything, you remain stuck in the relationship, but one day you see it. And this is the moment where perhaps the betrayal happens right in front of you, or someone else is there and sees it too, or someone else tells you, or someone else shows you the evidence, or the evidence shows up on an iCloud account and you can't not see it, or they treat a friend of yours really rudely, or they start poking at things in your life that feel like sacred no-fly zones, like a beloved family member or your children or a belief you hold. Whatever it is, they go there. And then, betrayal, blindness be damned, you see it. And that moment to get there, it can take months, it can take years, it can take decades. And some of that relates actually to what you learn about narcissism. Some of it relates to the supports you have access to, like friends or family or therapy or having other resources in your life. But one day you do see it. Well, the discomfort doesn't go away then. You see it, and then you feel shame. Lots and lots and lots of shame. Asking yourself and feeling, why did I wait so long? Why didn't I leave sooner? I knew years ago that this sucked, and now it's public, or it's really humiliating, or people knew for a while, or I knew for a while, and I didn't do anything. So once again, instead of turning the lens where it belongs, that this other person behaved badly and hurtfully, no. We then focus on the shame that we waited so long to do anything or even see it. We talk about ourselves as codependents and as part of the problem or as foolish. We may not talk about it at all because we feel humiliated. We may feel numb and then overwhelmed with anger and emotion. And people looking at us may see this strong emotion and judge us harshly too. And above all else, you feel shame, but the fact is, you've been feeling shame for a while. These relationships only work if you are willing to carry the burden of all of the shame in the relationship. If you are willing to carry their projected shame and the shame that grows for you as you stay longer and longer in these relationships, and even when you are betrayal blind, there's a sort of knowing in your body. So that shame quietly builds up. It takes a minute for our minds to catch up. And so even when we start to feel unstuck in these relationships, the shame can still keep us in that mindset that we had from the early days when we felt we were bad people for spying these red flags, these toxic patterns. But now we think of ourselves as foolish. We didn't see it. We're the ones who are needy. Some people still manage to get out at this point. Sometimes the narcissistic person leaves the relationship at this point. And a lot of people still remain stuck at this point. Strangely, we almost need to be bad in our minds for these relationships to work. And work, I think, is a bad term. I guess maybe I mean for these relationships to move forward, to sustain. And I've talked about this before in a video I did on debasement. You can go check that out. That basically we have to eat our own shit for these relationships to work. The narcissistic person can't be bad. Their own psyche doesn't tolerate that framework for themselves, at least not consciously. So we carry that projected burden. But the real challenge is that all of this seeps into our identity. And for a long time, sometimes a lifetime, we walk around and are always quick to take the blame. We know if we do that, then conflicts can be averted, trains can keep running on time, and that is what keeps things from escalating. We view ourselves as the problem, as the people who are just too damaged to make relationships work. And we put ourselves in a real sort of bind, in a can't-win situation. Because in the beginning of the relationship, we felt we were too quick to judge. And at the end, we felt that we were too slow in seeing it all, and we were foolish for staying. And we were full of shame on both ends of the relationship. The stuckness in these relationships is tough to break for a lot of reasons. Because it may not feel safe to leave, because of family court, because of finances, because of lack of support. But it's also tough to break for that reason, that we have to integrate this belief that we are bad because of our shame. These relationships are, in essence, it can almost feel like we're being programmed to become supply, to devalue ourselves, and to put another person's needs first all the time. And to keep accepting the narcissistic person's shame until it becomes our own. So many survivors blame themselves for letting it go on for too long and looking back and recognizing that the unhealthy cycles were present from the beginning. It contributes to all of the blame and shame. But you can and have to put the spotlight where it belongs. A person who was in a relationship with you emotionally mistreated you, and that's the problem. And parts of you, like your empathy, and even the pressure from the world to see the good in people, or give people a chance, or the benefit of the doubt, all of that combines to make it more likely that we get stuck in very unhealthy relationships. But it's their toxic and manipulative behavior that's the actual issue, not your badness. We have this unrealistic ideal of what the perfect survivor looks like. The perfect survivor is someone who doesn't leave too soon, but also who doesn't stay in the relationship too long. As though there is this perfect inflection point when you get just enough data, so you have just enough proof to show the world, so you can leave without people questioning you, but that you don't leave too soon, so you aren't viewed as judgmental, but you don't stay too long, so you don't look foolish. And of course, none of that accounts for processes like trauma bonding and manipulation, any of it. We aren't robots that crunch data and make personal decisions on the basis of algorithms. We are emotional. We are human beings. We want connection. We need connection. And we make allowances in the name of love. And the fact is, most of us were never taught what a healthy relationship looks like. But to see how a story begins with you feeling bad about seeing the red flags, ultimately ending up in a place of feeling shame about not seeing the red flags soon enough, all of that gives you a sense of how treacherous these relationships really are, and brings up that constant reminder that I always highlight, that you can't win. But understanding is a really important step to winning. Relationships end for lots of reasons. These can include lack of communication, incompatibility, differences in financial styles, work styles, how you think about money, wrong place, wrong time, right person, wanting different things. And frankly, I view these as sort of the healthy reasons relationships might end. Personally, that what I think that they speak to fundamental difference that at this time in history, people can reflect on and say, no, whatever this is, it's not working for me, and continuing to keep this relationship on life support can lead the people in the relationship to stop growing together, or even to stop growing altogether. And so sometimes the people in the relationship, based on some of these kinds of differences, end it. And some of them even stay friends, or at least they don't have long-term bad blood. Then I come back into my lane, and I think about narcissistic relationships. And the reasons that narcissistic relationships end can be quite different. For example, because the narcissistic person went to get new supply. Because you started to feel like you were experiencing symptoms of complex trauma. Because it's one of many breakups you have, and you just keep going between breakup and hoovering cycles, and it's an unhealthy breakup-makeup cycle, and that's the only way that the relationship works. Now, all that other stuff I listed, the lack of communication and the financial stuff and all the other stuff, that stuff may have been happening. But in narcissistic relationships, that's actually often not why it ends. The ending of narcissistic relationships and all the associated confusion, but the ending is never smooth. And there is typically long-term bad blood and lots of icky stuff like rumination, sadness, self-blame, you know the drill. I was recently reading a scientific journal article about relationships, and they got to this idea in the article of final straws. The relationship was rolling along, But the person in the relationship that they were interviewing in the study said that they split up, that they ended the relationship, or that the reason the relationship ended was because the folks said they hit the final straw. And there were 3 very consistent final straws that the researchers found: substance and alcohol use, domestic violence, and or infidelity. When one of those came into the picture, that was often cited as what ended the relationship. Now, in many cases, these final straws were very likely happening alongside other really unhealthy relationship patterns. But final straws are tricky because final straws don't always happen in a relationship, and they don't always happen in narcissistic relationships. Narcissistic relationships are a confused mess. Trauma bonded, maybe there's something I can change in myself, maybe it's my fault, maybe it's not that bad, maybe they didn't mean it, they said they're going to therapy, lots of people seem to like them, maybe I can find a way to say it differently. Or just in general, these relationships are unsettling. Things like, if I leave, I am going to get eviscerated in the divorce. Or you may have a fear of a smear campaign or custody battles. Or most people you know doubting you or maybe even shutting you out. Ending a narcissistic relationship is not about a lack of compatibility. Sometimes these relationships don't get ended because we are just trying to survive. So that takes us back to those final straws. I have no doubt that many of you in narcissistic relationships might have made a final straw your hard line in the sand. I'm out of here if they cheat. If they don't stop drinking, or if they get a DUI, or if they ever lay hands on me, I'm out. Those are things you see, and they're things you can see. Those are things you may sometimes, hopefully, many times, be able to get support for. If people think you're married to an alcoholic or a cheater or a physical abuser, you probably are more likely to get support compared to someone who's citing emotional abuse, and even then, you're not always likely to get support. But if you say that you're being gaslighted or don't feel emotionally safe, or that you're being chronically invalidated or minimized, you're more likely to face up to people who may say, well, it takes 2 to tango, etc., or relationships are hard. You know the drill. Even those folks who do end these relationships on the basis of incompatibility or communication issues, they'll face some of that, why did you end your relationship, heat. The difference is that if they are not in a relationship with a narcissistic person, then they don't experience the same kind of destabilization that happens when you are in a narcissistic relationship. And even if people are critical of you leaving, you may feel you have more psychological safety as you decide to leave the relationship and aren't expending lots of bandwidth on how do I leave this without ruining my life. Now, these final straws are not a given in a narcissistic relationship. And while these final straws are not uncommon in narcissistic relationships, not all narcissistic relationships get there. And some folks wait. They wait for a final straw. In fact, it's sort of a dark future fake within yourself. Someday if I catch them cheating, I'm out. Or I'll get him on video throwing something at me and then I'm out. There is so much self-gaslighting that happens in these relationships that these final straw type things can even substantiate your sense that, see, they did that. I deserve to leave. I have the right to leave. Or simply, you'll say, this is real, see? So I can leave. And the drug and alcohol one is tricky in narcissistic relationships. There's a lot of overlap with a substantial chunk, in fact, some studies estimate almost half, of people living with addiction or problem substance or alcohol use also have antagonistic personality styles like narcissism. Again, a lot of overlap. And for a long time, you may think their general assholery is due to intoxication or just being an addict. But should they get sober, the assholery goes nowhere, and the behavior can get worse because now they no longer have drugs and alcohol regulating them at all times. So you may now deal with even more rage. But even then, for example, If their alcohol use, they were so disinhibited and impulsive it culminated in violence, or something that put you or your children in danger, like driving under the influence, that would be something more final straw-esque. And thinking about leaving and not doubting yourself about it may feel more accessible. I wouldn't argue that final straws always break the trauma bond. In some cases they may. A sort of breaking out of the dance of thinking, well, sometimes it isn't bad because you simply cannot unsee some of these final straw type of things. You can't unsee them happening. But many people remain in narcissistically abusive or other abusive relationships for reasons above and beyond just feeling that if they leave, that their lives are in danger. And those reasons are often related to the trauma-bonded patterns. I mean, the statistic is often circulated that on average, people in abusive relationships go back 7 times before finally leaving. The final straws, however, may result in other people giving more pointed advice in terms of giving you more support in therapists or other people around the situation, being more direct in what they believe you can do, or even in other advocacy resources being available to you. And listen, there are narcissistic relationships that do hit the final straw point, and that are not nearly as unhealthy and harmful as those relationships that don't hit the final straw point. The cumulative harms of psychological abuse in a relationship do not get adequately accounted for. In cases of coercive control, there may never be physical violence or drug and alcohol use or infidelity. But the people in those relationships are absolutely terrorized and imprisoned, even though the doors aren't literally locked, though sometimes they are. Remember, it's called a final straw for a reason, because there were lots of straws up to that point. And most of those other straws are not as clear cut and is often the day-to-day crap of the narcissistic relationship. Lots of bad relationship, like Lifetime movies and news stories and all the rest, are about these final straw relationships. I have almost never seen the one that doesn't go there, where there's not final straw stuff, but lots of little straws. And we have full empathy for the survivors in those final straw movies. But what we do not see is the day-to-day death by 1,000 cuts, the chipping away of a person through multiple daily indignities. Sadly, in our cultures, even in the most unhealthy and toxic of these, they may still be viewed as, well, that's marriage, or no relationship is always easy. Don't get me wrong. People in final straw relationships are definitely suffering, and many have been suffering for a long time. But for those of you in long-term narcissistic relationships who feel unheard and unseen and also confused because you haven't hit a final straw, or don't feel you have a good enough reason to consider maybe that this relationship isn't good for you, or you're gaslighting yourselves in the absence of that so-called last straw, sometimes they don't come. And I got to tell you, I've seen this repeatedly in my career. Even when they do, people in narcissistic relationships especially will future fake themselves and say, okay, yeah, I know, I'd say I'd leave if they cheated, but I just saw a text. Maybe it wasn't that bad. Or they said they'd go to therapy. Or they didn't throw that thing at me. They just threw it at the other side of the room. In narcissistic relationships, that damned camel has a really strong back. And one final straw rarely breaks it. Thanks again.